Hello guys, I am obviously not here today. I am ill, planning on being back tomorrow, but for now I want you to get out your journal prompts page. We answered the first prompt last time. We're going to focus on the second prompt today, and our second prompt is how can speech help and how can speech hurt? So I want you to look at it, and I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, and I want you to write down an answer to the prompt. All right, it has been 3 minutes, so finish up your writing, and I want you to turn to a partner next to you or a little group of 3 beside you, and I want you to take about 2 minutes to discuss your answers together as a little group. All right, so time is up. I want you to turn around, face the front, stop talking, and get your textbook out. We're going to turn to page 5 and pick up right where we left off. You are also going to need your chapter 1 notes. Remember, this is what the front looks like, and then if you flip it over on the back, you'll see our vocabulary that we're going to find in our text as well. All right, here's what we're going to do. You're going to turn to page 5, and I am going to read the rest of this chapter to you, and we're going to fill in our notes as we go. All right, let's get started. So, how does one actually bake a cake? Interestingly, for Aristotle, it is also the work of the intellect that helps here. For knowing is not the intellect's only function. It also helps one to do. The intellect, then, can also be practical. It can come alongside and actively help in the work. It calculates, measures, and plans, all in order to get that cake to the table. So if you flip over to the vocabulary on your notes, then you will see that one of the definitions is seeking to do. So go ahead and write the word practical and the word blank besides seeking to do. All right, and I'm going to keep reading below the little brain diagram in our textbook. Now, you might notice that the theoretical intellect and the practical intellect are rarely exercised simultaneously, which is why people tend to wind up strong in one and weak in the other. Think, for example, of the absent-minded professor who is brilliant at quantum physics but cannot match his socks. Considering this, Aristotle does something truly ingenious in calling rhetoric the counterpart of dialect. He is making the claim that rhetoric is not only an exercise of the theoretical intellect, which remember is seeking to know, it's actually the exercise of the practical intellect, which is seeking to do. So rhetoric is seeking to do. It's practical. Don't be mistaken. That's no knock against it, not at all. After all, the practical intellect is vital for life on Earth. The chair you're sitting on was made by a practical intellect, as were the clothes you were wearing. But what's the point of sitting in chairs and wearing clothes if you can't contemplate higher things, such as love and beauty and truth? If both the theoretical and the practical intellects are necessary for flourishing human community, and they are, then so are dialect and rhetoric. Because remember, they're counterparts. They work together, so they're both necessary. Because dialect and rhetoric are parts sung by all citizens, we often end up with civic speech akin to bad karaoke. It's also true that some speakers are naturally gifted, and a few are just plain lucky. So what about the rest of us? Those for whom public speaking is often awkward and almost always nerve-wracking. Aristotle offers us hope. We can learn by watching and practicing. Practicing is super important too. In other words, we can see what works and what doesn't work from other speakers. We can turn what might be otherwise random or intuitive behavior into principles to be known and used. Rhetoric can become something more than just plain luck. It can become an art, a reason to practice. Here's another place for you to put a vocabulary word on the back. A reason to practice is an art. So you're going to write art beside a reason practice. A scientific analysis of persuasive speech means that the entire project of persuading others, that suspect business of potential sophistry or verbal trickery, is brought into the light of reason. And another vocabulary word for your back page, verbal trickery is sophistry. So make sure you fill that in. Verbal trickery is sophistry. In doing so, we will grow not only in skills as speakers, but also in shrewdness as listeners. But why bother with rhetoric? By 350 BC, rhetoric had already earned itself a bad name. The sophists, foreigners who taught young Greek men how to persuade and manipulate, had split rhetoric from ethics, using speech as a clever means to any profitable end. All right, here's another vocabulary word. The word sophists goes by foreigners who taught young Greek men how to persuade and manipulate. That would be sophists. Let's continue. And Plato, calling rhetoric mere flattery, had divorced it from philosophy. But Aristotle brushes off both the glitz and the grunge from rhetoric and reestablishes it as a necessary, even worthy topic of study. He analyzes the art of rhetoric and attempts to bring it under the rule of reason. Reread the excerpt at the beginning of this chapter. You'll notice that Aristotle makes the claim that rhetoric is actually a potential good. All right, flip back to pages 2 and 3 where that excerpt is, and I actually do want you to reread it with that in mind, that rhetoric is meant to be good. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, read it silently to yourself, and again, think about it. Rhetoric is meant to be good, and that's what Aristotle's saying here. All right, we should all be done reading that now. So go ahead and flip back to the top of page 6, and we are going to go ahead and pick up right where we left off. Aristotle's first argument is made in terms of use and abuse. In the philosophical dialogue Gorgias, Socrates accuses rhetoric of making the weak argument appear stronger. Aristotle turns this attack on its head. Rhetoric can just as easily come to the aid of truth, assisting the truly stronger argument when it appears to be weak. Aristotle's second argument is that because one cannot always teach, our poor brains sometimes need a break. Rhetoric is necessary, even good. Like dialectic, rhetoric uses logos, reason, but it also draws upon the speaker's ethos, credibility, and the audience's pathos, emotion, in order to persuade. All right, look at the vocabulary chart again. These are our last 3 vocabulary words for this lesson. Logos goes by reason, ethos goes by credibility, and pathos goes by emotion. So make sure you get all of those written down in the chart as well. Let's continue. That is, rhetoric recognizes that people make decisions based on factors other than pure reason. Next, rhetoric can help a speaker understand the issue at hand more fully. In other words, preparation for an argument should involve both sides of a case, not in order to choose one side willy-nilly or for personal gain, but rather to better understand all of the ins and outs of the argument. Finally, Aristotle says that just as someone should be able to defend his body from attack, so too should he be able to defend his beliefs. In fact, the ability to defend yourself only against physical attacks is less than human, for even the beasts do this. For Aristotle, because our distinction is our ability to speak, defending ourselves with words is the higher and nobler art, and our verbal defense is the art of rhetoric. All right, look at the bottom of page 6 with the little box, and if you see, I put it on your notes page for you, and I put a little emoji that I thought kind of represented each one on your notes page, maybe to help you remember them. But these are 4 reasons why rhetoric is useful that we kind of just talked about. 1, to assist the truth. 2, to persuade when logos alone isn't enough. 3, to see both sides of an argument. And 4, to defend one's beliefs. And so I did a little church for truth, a little brain for logos, little glasses for seeing both sides of an argument, and swords for defending one's beliefs. All right, look at the top of the second column. Another way of saying it is this: doesn't the truth deserve to be protected? If, in the dealings of the city, a counterfeit wins over the truth, someone is to blame for allowing the truth to go undefended. Aristotle's audience, we should remember, is the aspiring idealist who claims to care about the fate of truth and justice. Aristotle is calling this philosopher to defend truth within the city. Aristotle is calling the good man to become what Quintilian would call the good man speaking well. Relying on common opinion. Common sense, as we all know, can be quite a misnomer. Sometimes it's not all that common, and sometimes it's not all that sensible. But Aristotle is willing to place his bets on common opinion, what he calls endoxa, which we put in our vocabulary the other day. Because, as he says, it's not usually very far off from the truth. Quote, "The true and the approximately true are apprehended by the same faculty. It may also be noted that men have a sufficient natural instinct for what is true, and usually do arrive at the truth." End quote. The kind of inexact knowledge the approximately true gives us is a good starting point for personal understanding, and it is also a great basis for speaking with an audience. After all, audiences aren't often comprised of logicians and philosophers. They're usually full of ordinary people with conventional beliefs. These conventional beliefs are, by definition, endoxa, which can serve as a springboard for making new judgments. By knowing what the audience holds to be true, the rhetor can reveal his or her position as the logical deduction of what the audience already believes. So guys, it's so important that we know some things about our audience before we deliver a speech or before we write what we're going to write. We have to know our audience because it will help us with what we write. If we don't take the time to learn about our audience, then we're experiencing a setback already. All right, page 7. But Aristotle isn't a Pollyanna about common opinion. He knows very well that the thoughts on the street can be contradictory or even flat out wrong. The fact that endoxa falls short of perfect reliability means that the judicious rhetor must be choosy in opting for one belief over the other. As such, Aristotle's reliance on endoxa presupposes a rhetor who seeks real truth outside of its many imperfect and jumbled renderings. Because wisdom is the final goal, the best rhetor is an aspiring philosopher. Defining rhetoric. Aristotle begins by calling rhetoric the antistrophis of dialect, but he then goes on to define rhetoric more specifically. He defines rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, which we wrote this definition down the other day together. So this should be on the front page of your notes already. Let's carefully examine that definition, starting from its end goal and its final term, persuasion. Notice that Aristotle does not see rhetoric as a type of force, as if the audience is strong-armed into agreement based on sheer logic or mere emotional pull. Instead, the goal is convincing something closer to counsel than force. Moving back to the beginning of Aristotle's definition, we find what might be a surprise. The art of rhetoric for Aristotle begins with observation. Aristotle emphasizes that one achieves the end goal of persuasion by first observing, by seeing. The rhetor then is not a maker as much as a seer. In this way, the rhetor is akin to the philosopher, who wants to see the truth. In this case, the truth of which means are available. Rhetoric is, in a way, the discerning of wisdom. It is the power of seeing what ought to be practiced in the moment. The next key term in Aristotle's definition of rhetoric is available. Sometimes the rhetor will see that she can use certain arguments to persuade a given audience at a particular time. But those same arguments and proofs may not be available in a different context, in a different rhetorical situation. This is the one reason why you might use different arguments with your mother than you would with your father. That would be the rhetorical situation, to convince each parent to grant you permission to do something. No one makes decisions in exactly the same way and for exactly the same reasons. Plus, reality, as well as the soul of the audience, is not entirely under your control. That is to say, people aren't the only limiting factor. The circumstances at hand can alter, and the rhetorical possibilities will change too. In the case of trying to convince your mother, say, to allow you to borrow the car, it will matter very much whether you have recently had an accident. Ask her 1 week, and she may give you an easy yes. But if you get involved in a fender bender, the circumstances will change. You have to work much harder for an affirmative. Aristotle's definition tells us that rhetors should look different from sophists, who, at best, focus on the here and now, amounting to a short-sighted convincing. At worst, sophists make the weaker argument appear the stronger one, resulting in manipulation. Rather, the true aim of a good rhetor is to see the rhetorical situation blossom forth in its fullness, with all of its radical contingencies accounted for by the speaker, who helps the audience flourish within the realm of language. In short, rhetoric can help reveal the best goods, and that's a good thing. The 3 rhetorical appeals that Aristotle discusses, which will be examined fully in this book, are ethos, pathos, and logos. Aristotle believes ethos, the speaker's character, is so important that he calls it, according to one translation, quote, almost, so to speak, the controlling factor in persuasion, end quote. One must appear to know what is right, do what is right, and want what is right for one's audience. Pathos, the second appeal, concerns the emotions, and it can be a real trouble spot for the rhetoric because of the potential for manipulation and abuse. By showing that emotions are obedient to reason, Aristotle ties pathos to logos, healing both the Platonic and sophistic splits that did such damage to rhetoric proper. Finally, logos will be discussed in this text, with special attention given to the enthymeme. We're going to have a whole section on each one of these this year, and so don't worry, we're going to dive into these fuller. Rhetoric and the Transcendentals. Before explaining his project, Aristotle offers some comments on the state of rhetoric. From his rebukes, we can bet that rhetoric looked a lot back then like it does now. Overdoses of the emotional appeal, disregard of wisdom, and plenty of suspect speakers. And his audience seems no better off than today's masses either. Aristotle says that judgments tend to be made based more on feelings of friendship or hatred or self-interest than on clear-sighted prudence. This is an example of bias. We talked about this in 8th grade last year when we read books like To Kill a Mockingbird. So this would be an example of bias, which is pretty common in rhetoric. What we have here then is an ancient but surprisingly relevant book. And the fact that it was composed by the man single-handedly responsible for so much of Western philosophy means we can expect an insightful inquiry to civic speech. Rhetoric is inescapable. It is the speech of the city, and it is also the most available vehicle we have for encountering truth. Hence, rhetorical arguments are often necessary. This is the case especially in matters where certainty escapes us, which we must admit is probably most of life. So we must take the art seriously if we are to attempt it at all. Aristotle's task, then, is a noble one, to offer the city and the household a way of better understanding their speech. He seeks to bring rhetoric into the domain of reason as much as possible, isolating and distinguishing the 3 types of civic rhetoric: deliberative, concerning the advantageous; epidictic, concerning the honorable; and judicial, concerning the just. This articulation divides rhetoric into judgments about things that are good, beautiful, and true, respectively. That is, whereas dialectic seeks to understand the good, the beautiful, and the true in their absolute senses, rhetoric tracks them in their real-world manifestations, those things that are advantageous, honorable, and just. If all rhetoric discourse falls within one or more of these 3 categories, as Aristotle urges, then this division suggests something about humanity itself. Our desire is for what our tradition calls the transcendentals: goodness, beauty, and truth. All right, so if you look at the front page of your chapter 1 notes, this should be the last thing that you have to fill in, the 3 transcendentals at the bottom. The first one's goodness, the second one is beauty, and the third one is truth. So make sure you put those in the box at the bottom of the page. Alright guys, here's what I want you to do next. I want you to look at pages 9 through 13 of your textbook. This is part of Plato's The Republic, and it is his famous cave allegory. And what I want you to do is I want you to take the rest of class, I want you to read it to yourself and think about it. Don't worry, we're going to read it and talk about it together when I come back, but I want to give you a head start. I want you to go ahead and read it alone and try and understand it by yourself before we talk about it together. When you finish reading it, I want you to get out a piece of notebook paper for me and just write down 3 to 5 sentences about what you think Plato is saying here about rhetoric, and then turn it into the tray before you leave. Once that's turned in, you may work on something for another class until the period is over, but get that turned in before you leave class today. I miss you guys. I love you guys. Thank you so much for bearing with me today. I know it wasn't the most exciting, but I wanted to keep you guys caught up. So that way we don't get behind already. But like I said, love you, miss you. I will be back tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for working so hard.